Hi, everyone. I believe we are live. My name is Andrea Loken, and I am the local teachers president for the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation here in Limestone, District 27. And we've collaborated with our Upper Canada neighbors, OSSTF District 26, to do this three-part webinar series to shine the light on some of the issues that have become more pressing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. For our third and final episode in this series, we're going to take a critical look at e-learning with Dr. Beyhan Farhadi. Welcome, Beyhan.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Farhadi is a secondary school teacher who recently received her PhD in geography from the University of Toronto. She also has a Master's of English from York University. And she's been doing research to examine the relationship between e-learning and educational inequality. It's wonderful to have Beyhan's perspective in this webinar series because she's coming at it from both a practical and an academic perspective. Not only has she done the research, she's a frontline worker and has taught e-learning courses. So e-learning has been very topical in the current Ontario education system because the Ontario government wants to run an e-learning experiment that involves mandating secondary students to achieve at least 2 of their high school credits through e-learning. And so as a result, Beyhan's been sought out by some news outlets to comment on the government's plans. She's appeared on TDO, City News, The National, CBC Radio, to name a few. As educators, we've now been launched into this new paradigm of education from a distance, and we're finding out just how messy and difficult it is to provide inclusive, engaging instruction. To be clear, what we're doing right now is not really e-learning. It's emergency remote learning or distance learning, and it may look nothing like e-learning when we're not in a pandemic. And I'll be asking you, Beyhan, to clarify exactly what we mean by e-learning. But before we get into the webinar, I'd like to share that the first 2 Pandemic Ed episodes are available at our channel. The topics we've covered are the impact of screen time on students' learning and on brain function with occupational therapist Chris Rowan. And we've looked at protecting digital privacy within educational technology with Dr. Thomas Cook last week. This talk today will be available after the live event at the same link you're accessing now. I'd also like to mention that viewers, if you have questions during the presentation, you can put them in the live chat in the YouTube feed, and go ahead and even start asking your questions before you start. If you like, load that as soon as possible, because we'll track and moderate your questions and ask them of Beyhan towards the end of the webinar. Also, if you just are on and you would like to let us know who you are, where you're from, what your affiliation is, that would be wonderful to start that in the live chat. So thanks for your participation tonight. We're going to begin our talk with Beyhan Farhadi right now. And maybe I can just ask you, Beyhan, what got you interested in studying e-learning as a topic? And is there much research out there, or are you somewhat of a pioneer?
I'm going to address your questions a little bit in reverse. So the first is, I guess, the piece on research. I usually ask what we mean by research, because there are associations that require membership, like the International North American Council for E-Learning or the smaller scale Canadian E-Learning Network, and they are frequently referenced. These kinds of associations do really high level work, surveys and policy assessments, and are often sponsored by ed tech companies such as Desire to Learn or K-12 Incorporated. In Canada, there is the yearly State of the Nation survey released by Canadian E-Learning Network, but these kinds of surveys tend to have a lower response rate. So in Canada, it's around 20%, and in Ontario, we're looking at around 10%, which is really useful for determining the kinds of questions we want to ask, but not for telling us what's happening on the ground. And so when we're talking about so that's kind of the nonprofit sector, and then there's the academic space of research where e-learning is more focused on instructional design in K-12. And so that's really concerned with designing and producing the optimal experience learning online. There is some interesting work in that space, but it does tend to uncritically embrace learning technologies and doesn't sufficiently discuss the relationship between power and profit, or the impact of online learning on student identity and learning communities. So it's not really a literature that is explicitly concerned with preserving public education. And so I don't, contrary to the attention that I've received, I don't brand myself as an e-learning researcher or even an e-learning teacher, despite having taught e-learning for a really long time. I was first to study the relationship between educational inequality and e-learning in publicly funded high schools. My research looked at the largest school board in Canada, the Toronto District School Board, and during sort of 2016 to 2017, but the data that I received covered the entire length of the program from 2010 to 2017. How I was able to do this was because I was one of the first teachers to join the e-learning program when it was launched regionally in Toronto in 2010. And so I have been teaching e-learning off and on for the past decade, but I've also, worked in face-to-face classrooms and balanced it with graduate work. I've done work as a guidance counselor and worked in an alternative program as well. So what really brought me to graduate work and the research that I did now that resulted in the dissertation was because of the gap in knowledge about e-learning, which is not really thinking only about who is taking it and where are they, but also looking at what engagement looked like online, why students were taking it, but most importantly, who was left behind. So this year, I'm back teaching at a secondary school in Toronto. I'm delivering remote instruction, like probably many of the viewers who are attending this session. I have 110 students approximately across 5 English classrooms, from 9 to 11, and one of my classes have English language learners in them. And then I'm also, of course, so you can imagine, I'm thinking about e-learning all the time, not just because of my professional experience and my sort of research background, but also I'm a parent to 2 children in the elementary school system. So it's just on my mind all the time.
Yes, and I'm a parent too, and 2 students in high school, and the idea of forced e-learning is rather unattractive to all of us. So it does heighten the interest in this topic for sure. So could I ask you to define what e-learning is then? When you say you're a teacher of e-learning, what does that mean?
Sure. So there are a few terms that I'll sort of share with you on the screen. Let's get that there. And so we are looking at a series of distinctions that I'll go through with you. So what, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that e-learning is not what is happening now. So that is, absolutely fact. And I think there is a way, though, that we are struggling with the narrative of what is happening right now, because I do think the Minister of Education in a lot of his communications has made an effort to align what we're doing with virtual learning. But e-learning as it's been currently practiced is full credit e-learning that's intended to replace the 110 hours of face-to-face instruction. Now, whether this happens is an entirely different story, but it's developed by Ontario teachers. It's interactive. It's increasingly interactive, especially in the senior grades, and it's preloaded into a learning management platform licensed from Desire to Learn. So really, right now, only 5% of students take e-learning in day school or summer school, and they are almost all grade 11 and 12 students. Right now, we're doing emergency remote instruction, mostly using Google Classroom from kindergarten to grade 12. Ontario only tracks who is taking online learning as a full credit option which I refer to as supplementary e-learning, and that's the second bullet point. A lot of e-learning, especially in the United States, is actually integrated into the face-to-face classroom. So that's blended or hybrid e-learning. This is actually not tracked in Ontario, so we don't know how many teachers right now are already using e-learning this way, but I am one of them, and I have integrated online learning into my classes in varying ways from September until now, in a way that is flexible, purposeful, and not as predatory as a fully enclosed system. So I'm more interested in how e-learning can strengthen, not replace face-to-face instructions. And lastly are the virtual and cyber schools, which are a total disaster. I won't talk very long about them, but I would point you to Michigan Virtual Learning Institute in a state, which is a state with the longest, oldest one credit mandatory e-learning program. So the virtual pass rates are 48% for students in poverty and 69% for those not in poverty, which really shows us that educational inequality is heightened, not alleviated online.
Yeah, that is really concerning, and that's from a group that wanted to make it, really was desired to make that successful. Wow. So the title of our webinar is Technology for Good, Myths and Realities of E-Learning. And there are some who believe that e-learning is going to transform and disrupt education as we know it. And I can't help but think of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, which applied in this case might mean that ed tech companies, many of them owned by huge corporations like Pearson, are poised and ready to exploit this pandemic to capture more of the public education sector. Do you think e-learning will suddenly be embraced due to this pandemic?
I appreciate the reference to Naomi Klein, who's done a lot of work tracing how disasters create the conditions of pushing through policies that make it possible for companies in particular to profit off of crisis. Dr. Dan Cohen at Queen's is an economic and urban geographer, and he wrote a fantastic blog recently about this through the Critical Geographies of Education specialty group, which I am a part of. And he warns us that marketization schemes that turn over the operation of public schooling to private actors like charter schools are really an important strategy to divert public funding away from corporate hands. And so he does a really excellent job of tracing the history of this. Part of the strategy, his argument is that it unfolds through partnerships with education technology companies. So in the United States, that's largely driven through two companies, K-12 Incorporated and Pearson Education. The reference to Pearson in your question is not only about e-learning, but it's also about hundreds of products and services that include online textbooks and application, learning management systems, testing tools, and so on. We have to move, I think, beyond the really narrow understanding of e-learning as kind of just an online classroom and think about the ways that companies are providing an extraordinary number of solutions that capitalize off of austerity policies in the public sector. So one piece of advice that Naomi Klein has for us is really to start organizing and making a case for fully funded, or in this case, for a fully funded public education system, because what happens after COVID will depend upon, as she says, the kind of ideas we have lying around, and what ideas do we want to preserve about public education, and how do we make sure that those ideas are loud in the ears of those in power, who right now are networking with Microsoft and Google and Desire to Learn and Apple, among dozens of other companies who are trying to forge their way into the public education system through selling us the fantasy that education technology can solve our problems. And I think the most dangerous packaging of this is e-learning.
Okay, well, let's get into the myths then. E-learning is a tool in the toolbox of educators, but it's thought by some to be a panacea to some of the problems or perceived problems in public education. For example, the Ford government, among many other governments, they certainly are not alone. They've tried to make the case that education is too expensive. It's certainly a large part of provincial budgets. And people are expensive. It takes a lot of people to teach in schools and run schools and have students. And maybe this can be solved by forced e-learning. Maybe we can have larger classes in an online environment. Some problems have been created, perhaps by underfunding, or in Ontario, I would argue a flawed funding formula. So some courses can't be offered because maybe the classes are full, they're over capacity, or maybe it's a small school that can't run a full menu of all the options because they don't have the staff. And maybe e-learning can fix that. So is e-learning the solution? The structure of our conversation, we had decided, is going to revolve around 4 myths that you've identified, Beyhan. What do you think is the biggest myth about e-learning that we need to bust?
So the biggest myth about e-learning is that e-learning will happen with a computer and a connection. And I will refer us to a tweet that was shared by Stephen Lecce on April 17th, shortly after announcing a partnership with Apple and Rogers. He tweeted that this initiative will, quote, universalize learning. I don't have to explain, given my comment about profiting off of disaster, how it is why it is a problem to have Apple and Rogers gain so much influence in public education at this moment. And so I think that, what I observed was a public instinct to commend the minister for the deal, even though it was a cost that the school boards had to assume. And so the story he wanted to tell us was that this deal solved the inequality problem of remote instruction, but this is not the case. So I think it's really important to ask the question, why students are motivated to learn. And it's not just about access to tools, which are important, but it's just one of a dozen variables, including prior knowledge that makes it possible to even begin with the material that's provided by the teacher, physical safety and well-being, feelings of belonging, friendships, peer supports, relationships to the teacher, the learner's immediate environment, which might look like them hunched over a sofa with an iPad they can't type with. Students also need a caring adult to motivate them face-to-face from home. And that's left to the caregiver at this moment, but it's also left to the caregiver often with e-learning. Online, a teacher can't compel a student to participate. And we know that a caregiver's role in a student's life is really structured by privilege quite profoundly. So that might look like, accreditation and cultural competency, social and economic capital. The entire point of public education is to level the playing field and make it possible for students to maintain a high level of motivation at school. And so I think we need to be really specific about the barriers that exist to access beyond just a computer and a connection. And this differs from student to student, but it's also, there are also systemic barriers that affect equity-seeking groups, right? So I think we need to have more system-oriented conversations about equity.
Right. And you're talking about motivation there for a moment. And anecdotally and through social media, I've seen some pressure from parents sometimes to provide assignments with deadlines and grades within this emergency learning framework. Teachers might even believe that this is necessary to keep their students engaged online. There's a belief that without grades, students won't be motivated to learn. And that's not just in e-learning, that's within our current system within 4 walls. We appear to rely heavily on grades for both motivation and accountability. Is e-learning different from in-class instruction somehow? And what about emergency learning during a pandemic? Do we need to be grading to keep them there?
Yeah, so that brings us to myth number 2, which is that students will not learn if they are not receiving a grade. And so I want to emphasize that we can have clear expectations without grades. We can have accountability without grades, evaluation without grades, boundaries without grades, and we can definitely succeed and fail without grades. And so a few seasons ago, I'll bring myself back here. Okay, all right, I am back. Okay, so yeah, a few seasons ago, I had a debate with an administrator, and it was around the question of what learning looked like and assessment looked like in e-learning. And it was really revolving around the funding, the ministry funding that was tied to students in e-learning, and the requirement at the time that teachers produce 20 grades in a report card for students to demonstrate full participation online. So the irony is the marketing around e-learning has really been driven by this idea of mastery learning. And what that meant is that you can attempt an assignment multiple times until you can demonstrate mastery, right? So this is an idea that students work at a different pace. And the argument had always been that face-to-face, we didn't have the labor power to administer this kind of ideology. And educational technology companies came in and said, I have a solution for you, and that solution is e-learning. But the failure of this promise to kind of move us away from grades, that was really tied again to the marketing of e-learning and its inception, is illustrating how e-learning has been used to really replicate some of the worst parts of our traditional system, which central to which is grading. So this year, when I returned to teaching, I had asked various colleagues about the number of assessments that were expected to produce for a report card. And so I've gotten answers from, a dozen to 40. Mm-hmm. And there's never been a satisfying rationale that anyone has been able to provide for including so many grades in a report, other than imagining the wrath from management and parents, and also a lack of consensus about what grading actually means. And so Jesse Strommel at the University of Mary Washington has done a lot of work around the idea of ungrading, which really looks different from teacher to teacher, which can be minimal grading. Yay. So I only see myself, and it's very possible that I'm on a live stream without a host, which is just fantastic. Oh, we're back.
Okay, we're back. Or not, because yeah. Okay, we're back.
Are we live, or are we in
liminal? I think we're back. Hey, we were just chatting. Our live stream went down, and we were saying this is exactly what happens in the classroom when you rely on tech. And so many times it's unreliable, right? Which is one of the reasons that we always have to be prepared to not use it. We cannot completely rely on it. And I mean, sometimes when it's gone for the whole day, right? Like you can't get online at all. There have been many times. So anyway, here we are, we're back, and let's try to get back to the questions. So I think you actually just finished one of the myths there. I'm just gonna see here. I can find it. So yeah, we had talked about the second myth. So I'm going to move to the third myth, and I have to say I have 2 kids in high school, as I mentioned before, and from anecdotal reports from other students and from my own kids' confessions, they're having a really hard time staying interested in their distance learning courses right now. And they're both in high school. They are normally very engaged in school. And it's not any reflection on what the teachers are providing. They're providing ample and easy to follow instructions. But without the in-class relationships with their peers and their teachers, which is key to keeping kids engaged in school, they are just tuning out. What then will motivate students online? Like, why would students want to do an online course?
So that brings me to myth number 3, which is that one that breaks my heart a little bit. It's that a teacher can motivate students to learn online. I will say sort of one thing before, jumping into it, and that is that, throughout my research when we're talking about e-learning incorporated in the best of times, there were teachers who would say to me, I don't know if I'm doing something wrong. So if there are any educators listening who are feeling their soul sink a little bit because they're not getting the participation that they would expect, I will say it's not your fault. And please don't internalize it. This tweet here was a response to the announcement previously referenced, that tweet by the Minister of Education, in which they ask what students are doing with these devices delivered by school boards. And I wanted to start here to remind us that it is not a computer and a connection that brings a student it doesn't keep a student in e-learning, even though it might bring a student to it. And so I think I'm going to just stop sharing here. I think it's important to really think about the variables that impact motivation. So we did talk about the computer and the iPad, physical safety and well-being, feelings of belonging and friendship and parental support. But it's also, as you mentioned, about the relationships to teachers and education workers, really about the equalizer of that common school space and time, access to guidance counselors, social workers, child and youth workers, and also student-centered spaces. And a lot of this we know is missing online. And I think that the most important variable that will help teachers understand the limits of e-learning is in how it organizes relationships in space and time, and which is probably why I studied this intuitively through the discipline of geography. So when we're thinking about face-to-face instruction, it often looks like a balance of direct instruction with cooperative and discovery learning. The former sometimes looks like chalk and talk, which can be effective in meeting gaps in knowledge and also sort of centering all students in the same, with the same knowledge base. But if we use this logic virtually, it often looks like synchronous instruction. What's happening right now, we're all sharing the same virtual space and time, even though we understand that the power dynamic is a little, is quite skewed to my end, right? And this is the case also with students. Students are, in the case of synchronous instruction, I think there's often a way that we think about the logic of face-to-face as looking like students being in a virtual space, all there at the same time with kind of their grids on face, the faces in their grids on video. But what I really found through my research is this is the least effective way and most problematic way of teaching online. So for one, students are not scheduled into a time and day, so we really can't expect them to be there. And as a result, we need to record those classes because we can't punish students who missed the session. But if you're recording the session, you also can't compel students to show their face. And I've watched like over 60 hours of synchronous instruction from 7 teachers, and I've taught for a decade. And I'm sure it exists, but it's rare to see a student voluntarily put themselves out on video and audio and have it recorded and available to other students. And so what this looks like is, if we're proceeding safely, we're looking at audio only spaces, maybe with the teacher's face visible if they're comfortable, maybe with half the class attending. And then as time goes on, fewer students attend because they can watch the recording after. But all of these sort of spontaneous questions that emerge in sharing the same time and space are missing. And I think that, those aha moments in teaching that many educators talk about is demotivating and sometimes absent. Missing that online is demotivating. And so I think we need to really revise how we understand motivation online. It doesn't look like live attendance. The structure of it doesn't lend itself to synchronous instruction. It's good to have it as a supplement, but it's not supposed to be the main way you teach. We need to think about online learning as often a really individual experience where students are not sharing the same time and space, and it may not look like the same kind of relationships that you develop in a face-to-face environment.
Well, it's interesting you bring up video conferencing because it is somewhat controversial for privacy reasons too. We talked about this with Dr. Thomas Cook. But again, I see quite a bit of pressure and might be self-imposed pressure that educators are putting on themselves to make themselves available. And it isn't just teachers, it's our adolescent care workers and our social workers that are being urged to be in these kinds of spaces. But back to e-learning then, does video conferencing have a place in e-learning? Like, I'm thinking of a lot of teachers just it's the best thing that parallels what they know, what they're used to, like being with their class all at the same time. And well, from my perception, it's really a struggle. Like it doesn't, so it's not working great. But what do you think the place is for video conferencing then?
I think in order to deliver equitable e-learning, we can't force students into that space at the same time. It's useful. I mean, I run synchronous sessions with all of my classes, and my highest attendance is actually my English language learners, because they are quite motivated to build the gap between they're in grade 11 university and they're going to be going to grade 12 university, and they are my only semestered class. So I've had them all throughout grade 10, and I have a very, very strong relationship with them, unlike my relationship with other students that I don't see on a daily basis. And so it's actually those relationships that is keeping those synchronous sessions more populated. But the place of synchronous sessions is really meant to be supplementary, which brings me to the fourth myth, which is that let's bring this up. It's a myth that virtual space can be democratic. And let me say full up that this is entirely up for debate. And I'm so happy to have debate because that's how I learn. So if you can, as if you can't tell from this tweet, I'm of this very strong opinion that online learning environments that are under intensified surveillance, and that's really the key word here, surveillance, cannot be emancipatory or democratic. As I mentioned, online learning is not designed for community or reciprocity or vulnerability in the way that we understand it in a face-to-face classroom. It's really designed for independent learning, and for learners who might want to convene and get together with peers to complete a task. But the relationship often stops at the end of the task, or it is defined by the task itself. So let me get back to my face. There we are. And so I think there's a compelling case to be made that, of course, face-to-face instruction is also undemocratic. I agree with that entirely. I think, though, it's not about, it's about how we're trying to build particular futures. So I agree that the present situation is unjust, and it's increasingly unjust because of the divestment of money from public education. But if our practice is moving toward a future of social cohesion, of cross-cultural respect and understanding, if our practice is including a goal to achieve collective freedom and social justice, we can't do these things behind a screen. So Dr. Cook work, last week really illustrated that online learning is not a neutral space. It is produced by private actors with a mandate to profit from public education. And so a lot of the interactions and the behavior that we see online is used to make determinations and optimize services and products that ultimately profit companies. So I think that, as a result of optimizing these spaces, educators receive a convenience that they sometimes can't refuse. And I think it's a struggle. I'm certainly not one to prescribe any course of action because we're all living in our contradictions, right? So we were talking just before the session about our relationship to Zoom, and I'm one to admit, sometimes I'll throw on the beach background and, have a drink with my friends on Zoom. But, it's entirely different when we're thinking about the ethics of putting adolescents in that space who may not, and and informing parents who may not be able to exercise informed consent. And so I think that this is a conversation that's less about public and private as separate spheres, but more about how democratic spaces such as public schools, but also expanding to public spaces beyond schools, are increasingly becoming marketized. I make this distinction because a separation of the private from the public sphere is quite a false one. For a long time, we've talked about e-learning being run by private companies, but we have a nonprofit public broadcaster, TVO, right, who was really centered in the first phase of the Learn at Home program. And this is owned by Ontario. And it's selling curriculum abroad for a profit. It is a company that pays the Ontario certified teachers really a third of what unionized workers make. And the students, as a result, have little access to their online teachers when they're enrolling for a credit, which they pay for. So, we need to exercise some critique of the way that our public system is being leveraged for profit. And I think, I look back at the release by the Toronto Star that really looked into what the motivation of the provincial government was with e-learning to begin with, which was about monetizing public education. And it's, this isn't speculation. It's kind of grounded in literature that traces, like the one I referenced from Dr. Dan Cohen, that traces the power and influence that companies are exerting over public education throughout North America. And that is an influence that we cannot as a public sector compete with. So we really have to be wise with regards to what we let in to the sphere, so that we don't repeat those mistakes.
Right. Well, we've gone through the 4 myths, and I guess I want to get to some of the solutions. Do we have solutions? Are we able to use this technology intelligently, and where do we want this to lead us?
So my answer, I'm not 100% sitting in. So I'd love to have a conversation about that. But I generally don't, I don't recommend rejecting education technology. It's interesting, if I think about my own public image, I've pretty much been cast as a person like really strongly, vocally against this e-learning mandate. And often people will say, well, you just hate e-learning. But to be able to say back to those folks that, I've been incorporating e-learning since September. I studied e-learning because I was teaching e-learning, and I've continued to teach e-learning, really goes to show that I'm making an informed decision when I'm speaking. And so I think the greatest weapon that's used against educators right now when it comes to e-learning is this idea that we have as a whole just rejected technology. We're Luddites, we're resistant to change and progress. And I've seen this narrative being leveraged through all of these op-eds, including in an op-ed by TVO. This idea that, oh, well, now it's here, I guess teachers have to accept it. They'll have to use it. And so I've been kind of an advocate of integrating and advocating for e-learning in our face-to-face classrooms through blended learning. Which is not tracked for a reason, right? It's not tracked because it's not self-contained, and the information that goes in there is not as valuable as a self-contained classroom that isolates students from their school community. So I think that we have the power to sort of shape a story, to move it away from a narrative that's looking at educational technology as a silver bullet to like fixing all of our challenging social problems, which really is coming because we are not investing in public education, and that the story is one we need to reclaim in this province, especially as we're moving through COVID-19 and whatever the world is going to look like on the other end. And I think that the minister has a platform, a really powerful platform, but we have the networks, we have the influence, and we need to ensure that those are in place, organized, so that we are in a position to kind of move him off his podium when the next provincial election arrives. Right.
Yeah, it certainly feels like a move. You use the term marketization. It's the moving things into the private sphere as much as possible by this government. But there was an excellent series of articles in the New York Times by Natasha Singer, a few years ago called Education Disrupted. And it was a series examining how Silicon Valley or big tech is gaining influence in public schools. One of the articles was called How Google Took Over the Classroom. And these articles paint a frightening picture of what has already happened to some degree in public education. So this idea about, your solutions like don't shy away from the tools, use the tools, but consciously and wisely. Is it possible to use the tools without being used by the tools? And do we need to rethink some of the things we've already done, perhaps naively?
So I'm not speaking from any area of expertise here, but I sort of am thinking with Dr. Cook last week too, who might have some interesting thoughts on what it means to produce or, look for what's already been produced by way of like, small tech solutions that can offer an alternative to corporate sponsorship. Because the issue is not so much the tools as it is who is producing them and to what ends. And I think there are a lot of teachers in this province who have been using these tools for a very long time, who have a lot of expertise. And so I think we need to challenge this idea that we need corporations to begin with, which is more of a fantasy than it is a reality.
Right. Because, I would argue that Google, Microsoft, Apple, they all want in because there's something in it for them, right? And it's, of course, I think we know that it's the data, the big data that's available through these tools. So I'm very conscious of that, and that's why we did one webinar on that. So I urge everyone to go back and look at that webinar with Dr. Thomas Cook and also the one with Chris Rowan. Both give us lots of food for thought, especially in this time of pandemic. So I'm going to move to a document that's collating the shared questions or the questions from the live stream, and I'll try to ask you a few of those before we wrap up tonight. So one question, actually this one's good because it brings in other workers in schools. So you mentioned this actually. What kinds of student supports are needed for e-learning? In secondary schools, we have adolescent care workers and student support counselors. We have vice principals. We have student success teachers, education assistants, and other workers. Is there some kind of online support available to students who are doing e-learning, or can these supports also move online? What happens in a virtual school? Can you speak to that?
So I don't have insight into how the various virtual schools, which are sort of like fully online, how they work. But my understanding of folks who are really enthusiastic about the potential of e-learning have said that, we all agree. It doesn't matter like what area of expertise someone has, how enthusiastic they are for e-learning or not. We're all saying the same thing insofar as this mandate, which is designed to put more students in that classroom, which is designed to, at the time that it was put forward, did not include explicitly teachers that were local to that school. That it was intended to be a cost-saving measure. And so folks who are advocates for e-learning actually say it costs more to implement e-learning. We absolutely need those social supports. And in fact, the students that I interviewed throughout my study were really high-achieving students. And even those students spoke quite at length about the really integrated social network that they depended upon in order to be successful in e-learning. And my fear is, that's a real minority of students when you're thinking about in the Toronto District School Board, it's less than 2%, but in the province, it's just 5%. And these are, again, students who are self-selected. They're not, mandated. And they have succeeded because they're integrated with face-to-face in their school community, and that their timetable is integrated with face-to-face instruction. So I can't say this enough, especially when people start to claim success because they see 80% plus success rates in Ontario. I say, well, that's because the funding that they're getting for online learning depends on them being in that school face-to-face, and they have access to those supports. And I don't know what that's going to look like when we are moving into a mandatory program, the design of which is actually removing resources from public education.
Right. Fewer teachers, but we also need fewer support staff if we do more e-learning. It seems. So another question: why can't teachers simply transfer many of the methods and tools they use in their regular classrooms and implement them to make e-learning work?
They are they're entirely different spaces that lend themselves, folks will say good pedagogy is good pedagogy. But I would, I have a child in elementary school right now, and I just received a series of emails from school council that were asking for my 2 cents about the number of split classes that are taking place. And so I'll actually even use this as an example, because we're thinking about online learning versus offline learning. But even within face-to-face learning, we have configurations of classrooms that require different strategies to allow learners to succeed. And that often looks like differentiated instruction. And so the more and it's also quite hard to determine what the learner's needs are in an online setting, because you really are depending on the product coming in, because because that relationship isn't developed, it's often difficult to get students to engage in formative work. So I think that's actually a huge distinction. As a teacher in a classroom, I depend on students doing their diagnostics. And in e-learning, we used to have a mandatory face-to-face meeting that students would not show up to. And then they had to remove it because you can't enforce it. You can only include things that students are, submitting for a grade. So I can't force them to submit a formative piece for me to give them feedback on if that's not something they're choosing to do. If they're in class, everyone's doing it, right? So there's the kind of collective space. I think we get a lot of data from students. I was teaching face-to-face. So I was teaching online today. And I remember saying, so I'm going through presentation strategies with them. And I said, so did you, was there another, I was doing PowerPoint. I'm like, did you want me to sort of go through a blog with you or a Facebook post? Because we were talking about digital literacy, and silence, nobody was typing. I was waiting for the nod, right? Like and I had to do this frequently. And I'll say to them, can you check off you have a little icon that they can put a thumbs up or a thumbs down. It's the information that we get in an online space in order to effectively teach is just so much more difficult than face-to-face, is I think what I would say.
Right. Well, there's just so much that class dynamic when you're there in a space with 25, 30 students, whatever it is. There's so much going on that there's just no way it can be captured in an online environment. Well, especially if it's asynchronous. So let's go to another question. You mentioned that virtual schools are a disaster for learning. Could you provide some insights about virtual classrooms?
So virtual schools are, in the case of Ontario, it would look like if a student has 8 classes that they're scheduled into, all of those classes would be virtual classrooms, all 8 of them. The work that's come out of Michigan has been useful because they're, I think, the only jurisdiction with mandatory e-learning that has done really transparent research into the success rates. And what they found is that the fewer courses a student is taking online, the higher their success rate is. And I think that is the distinction. And we're going to find that to be the case even with mandatory e-learning. I suspect that when we are forcing students into a fully online space, and I don't know how much of this is going to be, I mean, we need to look at what the collective agreement lends itself to in a local setting. But if it looks like e-learning as it currently stands, where a student is taking their entire course online with a teacher who's not part of their local school and who they cannot go to ask questions, we will see disengagement. I think a lot of students depend on that face-to-face environment to sort of proceed with learning.
Okay, let's try another question here. Do you think after this forced immersion in emergency remote learning and the additional investment in tech for students, do you think the digital divide will be diminished?
We don't know what those students are doing with those devices yet. So, I mean, yeah, like I think that we're going to, it's less an issue of how to use the device and more an issue of how do I enter the virtual classroom and engage with what's happening in that space. I have students who are using their own devices and have struggled, even though I have been going at this with them since September. I still have those handful of students, reluctant learners, who never made it in, who'll still give me a paper copy, even though I asked for it to be submitted online. And they, it had taken them weeks, even with me on the phone with them, to get into a virtual synchronous space with me. And the reason why that is I don't use Google Meets. I use the Desire to Learn platform, which is more secure, but also more difficult to learn. And so when we think about actually what the other end looks like on this, we're assuming that we're going to have teachers and students ready to use the licensed platform. And it's this licensed platform that is likely to deliver, that we're going to use in mandatory e-learning, if it is teachers delivering it in the school board. So we may have folks just, still unprepared because we haven't really proceeded with any kind of real experience learning online.
Well, it's interesting point that you made about we don't know what the students are doing with the devices. And in a face-to-face classroom, if you're expecting students' attention and that they are not on their phones or whatever devices they have with them, there's pressure for them to be there with you physically and pay attention and put their devices away. But when you're in an online learning environment, especially if it's asynchronous, you are like my daughter even says, like it's so hard. Like even though they're focused and motivated, it's so hard to not be distracted. Like you're checking email, social media, shopping, like it's just endless. It's so hard. It's hard for us as workers to stay focused online, and I imagine it's absolutely challenging for any student as well. Okay, let's go to another question. What roles can our unions play in addressing some of the concerns you've raised in the webinar? Do you see a role for OSSTF or?
Well, I think they're working through these questions. I was on a panel with Progress Toronto yesterday with the president of the Toronto local, Leslie Wolf, and one of the most interesting things she said to us is that the union can't control or prevent surveillance. And I think that's really important when we think about what kinds of risks teachers and education workers online are going to have to assume and think about weighing out when it comes to online learning. And I think that this synchronous piece is really, really important. And I'm hoping that there is perhaps clear best practices and direction about what those risks look like, so that teachers, when they're online, they are making informed decisions about what they're saying yes and no to.
It'll be interesting to see too who can be assigned to e-learning. Will it remain a completely voluntary thing, like self-identify? I would like to teach e-learning. That's how it is in my board right now, which has actually very little e-learning relative to some of the other boards out there. but there are teachers and educators that don't have access to devices or to internet, and so this raises another question. Of course, I think we would expect our employers to provide the tools, but currently they don't provide the tools for even our in-class instruction. You have many teachers bringing in their own devices because the school's devices are inadequate. So that's there is a question here, and it was basically that: how is it equitable for teachers in with that respect?
I mean, I understand what OECTA is doing with that, and my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it is a teacher's decision to teach e-learning. But the caveat is, what does a choice look like when there is pressure to fill the need? Because if that need is not filled, there is an option to hire outside. So there will be increased pressure, certainly, on teachers. And often it is younger teachers who are more precarious, and early career teachers rather, early career teachers who are precarious, who are going to experience the brunt of that pressure. And we really need to ensure that we're protecting folks who may find it more difficult to say no.
Right. Let's try one more question here. The lack of support is an issue. Who like when students aren't performing or behaving, I don't know what the word would be in an e-learning environment. Who's to contact home when a student is struggling with one or more classes in an e-learning environment? Is it the same dynamic?
It is not as accessible, the support. It's there in theory. So it depends on how, it really depends on how it's structured in your board, right? So right now, currently, there is a central e-learning is who I would send the email to, and they would contact the guidance counselor at the local school. So there's kind of like a two-step process. In my school, when I have an issue, during my prep, bounce down to guidance, have a really long conversation with a colleague about the student and, other students. So how's so-and-so, by the way, then the kind of information that we gather during those informal moments and are really important to supporting like students as a community. And that is definitely missing online, where often there is two steps removed from the principal or the vice principal or the, guidance counselors and social workers that we might know in our immediate environment.
Right. Well, Beyhan, this has been so informative, and we're so grateful that you've shared your knowledge with us. Thanks so much for doing this webinar.
Thank you. I was pumped, and I love the dialogue, and I really appreciate the questions. And if anyone here knows me from social media, I'm always around. So if you've got a question, send it over. And you can also send me an email, which is usually available through a Google search.
Well, and we're excited that this video will, of course, live on and be accessible after the fact so that people can view it later, and we can also go back and disseminate it. I know you are working with the OSSTF on the Distance Learning Advisory Work Group, so that's wonderful that they have your input there. And we've formed a similar group locally, so we're talking about some of these issues, and I know that this conversation will inform some of that work here. So I'm so grateful. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to our audience. And I also would love to thank all the people that worked behind the scenes to help organize this webinar series. We're excited to have done it, and just thank you all very much. We'll sign off.